Imagine walking into the Sistine Chapel, right? You're looking up at that majestic ceiling, and you are fully expecting to see this ethereal, beautifully painted fresco of angels and divine light.
Right, you're expecting pure perfection.
Exactly. But instead, you look up and notice the plaster is just covered in ink stains and lawsuits and, I don't know, mud.
Which is honestly a pretty perfect analogy for what we're looking at today.
Yeah, because that is exactly what it looks like when you study the founding of a religion up close. You expect this pure, uninterrupted spirituality, but what you actually get is this really messy collision of heaven and earth.
And that collision is incredibly messy. I mean, we're looking at the founding of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, specifically between 1829 and 1830.
Which is such a wild time period.
Oh, absolutely. Because starting a religious movement isn't just about visions and epiphanies, you know. It requires navigating mundane things like printing costs and understanding 19th century copyright law and jumping through all the bureaucratic hoops of legal incorporation.
So we are doing a custom deep dive today for you, our resident learner, exploring that exact intersection where divine visions met gritty, real-world logistics. We've got a whole stack of historical records, accounts from early members, and foundational texts like Section 20 of the Doctrine and Covenants to go through. Okay, let's unpack this.
Well, the first major logistical hurdle they faced was something that sounds incredibly mundane, but was absolutely critical. They had to publish a book.
Right.
Joseph Smith had just spent 3 months dictating the translation of this massive 590-page manuscript, what would become the Book of Mormon.
3 months for nearly 600 pages is incredibly fast.
It is. But having a manuscript and having a published book in the 1820s were two entirely different universes.
Yeah, because you can't just, upload a PDF or send it to a print-on-demand service.
Exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
Printing a book of that size meant sending every single letter by hand, backwards, on a metal tress. So Joseph approached a local printer in Palmyra, New York, a guy named Egbert Grandin. And what's interesting is Grandin was actually the exact same age as Joseph Fizong. They were both just 23.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize they were that young.
Yeah, very young. But Grandin initially flat out refused the job. He thought the whole thing was a fraud, and he really didn't want his professional reputation tied to it.
But we know he eventually caves, right? So why does he change his mind?
Money. But with some pretty astronomical conditions attached. Grandin demanded $3,000 up front to print and bind 5,000 copies.
$3,000 in the 1820s.
It was a staggering sum. And Joseph Smith, whose family were essentially poor tenant farmers, absolutely did not have it. The only person in their circle who could even entertain a number like that was a man named Martin Harris.
Okay, this is where I start thinking of Martin Harris like a modern venture capitalist.
That's actually a great way to look at it.
Right. Because imagine being a wealthy, established farmer in your community. You have this highly successful portfolio, which is your farm. And now you're being asked to risk literal financial ruin on this incredibly controversial, totally unproven startup that your own neighbors are actively mocking.
Right.
Why on earth would you do it? Why risk the farm for a project that everybody around you thinks is a joke?
What's fascinating here is how the divine mandate was deeply tied to profound human sacrifice. Because Harris was terrified of losing his farm. I mean, naturally, he hesitated.
Understandably.
So he asked Joseph to seek a revelation on his behalf. And the resulting text, which is now Section 19 of the Doctrine and Covenants, essentially tells Harris not to covet his property.
Oh, wow. That's direct.
Very direct. It commands him to impart it freely for the printing of the book. And it draws a direct parallel to the Savior's own sacrifice to do the Father's will, regardless of the personal cost.
So the psychological weight is placed squarely on his shoulders. Like, it's not just a business decision anymore. It's a spiritual ultimatum.
It was. And Harris ultimately obeyed. He went ahead and mortgaged his entire farm to guarantee the payment to Grandin.
That takes so much conviction.
It really does. And once the money was secured, it took Grandin and a dozen men 7 grueling months of manual labor to actually print the thing.
So the translation took 3 months, but the printing took 7.
Exactly.
And even with the funding secured and the printing underway, they immediately run into intellectual property theft. Because another guy in town, Abner Cole, decides he wants a piece of the action.
Oh, Abner Cole is a wild character.
Right.
He was a former judge, and he was using Grandin's printing press at night to publish a local newspaper called The Reflector.
Which is just so sneaky.
Yeah, well, the unbound pages of the Book of Mormon were just sitting there in the shop overnight. So Cole started sneaking them into his own newspaper, printing these excerpts alongside his own mocking, sarcastic commentary.
It's literal intellectual property theft before the book is even on the shelves.
And Joseph Smith lived in a completely different town at the time, so he had to rush back to Palmyra in the dead of winter just to confront Cole at the print shop.
Okay, paint the picture of this confrontation for me,
Yeah.
because this is where the spiritual and the legal really clash in such a tangible way.
So Cole is entirely unrepentant. He literally takes off his coat, rolls up his sleeves, pounds his fists together, and tries to start a physical brawl right there in the print shop.
A former judge trying to start a fist fight.
Yeah, he yells at Joseph, telling him if he wants to fight, to just come on and fight.
And Joseph doesn't take the bait.
He doesn't. He calmly smiles, tells Cole to put his coat back on because it's cold, and flat out refuses to fight him. But then, and this is the crazy part, Joseph plays his trump card.
Which is?
He doesn't threaten Cole with divine wrath or anything like that. He threatens him with federal law.
I love that.
Joseph had shrewdly filed for a copyright before the translation was even finished, specifically to protect against this exact scenario.
That is so smart.
He points out that he holds the copyright and promises to use the full weight of the law against Cole if he doesn't stop printing the pages.
And Cole knows he's legally cornered, so he backs down.
Yep, it's a brilliant juxtaposition. You have a man claiming to speak for God, utilizing the relatively new mechanisms of U.S. copyright law to protect a sacred text.
It's so practical.
Extremely practical. And finally, on March 26, 1830, all the labor, the financial ruin for Harris, the legal threats, it all culminates. The first copies are officially made available to the public.
You can practically smell this moment in the historical records. They say the books were bound in brown calfskin with gold lettering on the spine, smelling intensely of leather and glue and paper and ink. It makes the ethereal suddenly very, very tangible.
It really does. But, a book is just a book until there's an actual community organized around it.
Yeah.
And creating a legal community meant jumping through an entirely new set of secular hoops.
Right, because you can't just walk outside and declare yourself a church. Well, maybe you can, but if you want to own property or be legally recognized, you have to play by the state's rules.
Exactly. To fulfill New York State's legal requirements for incorporating a religious society, you needed a specific number of trustees. So on April, people gathered in a small log home owned by Peter Whitmer Sr. in Fayette, New York.
60 people in a log home must have been packed.
It was standing room only. And out of that group, they had to choose exactly 6 people to be the first official legal members of the church to satisfy the law.
The logistics of that are fascinating, making sure you hit the legal quota. But the emotional release of that day is really what stands out to me.
Absolutely.
Because for years, Joseph Smith's parents had been walking very different religious paths. His mother was deeply invested in seeking a church, while his father had grown super cynical of organized religion and just stayed aloof.
Right, which was common then.
But on this day, Joseph stands by a stream and watches both his mother and his father get baptized into the church he just organized.
The religious trauma of that era, especially in what was called the burned-over district of New York, heavily fractured families. People were constantly arguing over which faith was right.
Yeah, it was a very intense religious climate.
So for Joseph, seeing his parents united in this new faith was overwhelming. The accounts say that when he pulled his father out of the water, he buried his face in his father's chest and wept. He cried out, "My God, I have lived to see my father baptized into the true church of Jesus Christ." Later that night, the motion was so heavy he had to slip away into the woods just to process it all, and friends found him out there weeping with joy.
It's such a raw human moment. But inside that log cabin, amidst all those tears and spiritual outpourings, they were also establishing a highly structured parliamentary procedure for governance. They called it common consent. And honestly, wait, hold on, I have to push back here.
Go ahead, what's the issue?
If Joseph Smith is claiming direct revelation from God to lead this church, like if he is saying the heavens are open and God is telling him exactly what to do, why on earth is he making the congregation vote on it?
That's a very fair question.
They literally raised their hands to approve church business, borrowing a mechanism from the British House of Commons. Doesn't relying on a Democratic majority vote completely undermine the idea of a divine mandate?
It sounds like a massive contradiction, doesn't it? But you have to look at the mechanism behind it. Common consent wasn't about the members debating doctrine or creating truth by majority rule.
Okay, so what was it doing?
It was a mechanism for transparency and accountability. An earlier revelation had commanded Joseph and his scribe, Oliver Cowdery, not to officially ordain each other until the believers could decide by vote if they were willing to accept them as leaders.
Oh, I see. So it's not about voting on what God said. It's about voting on whether they consent to be led by the person saying it.
Precisely. It required the members to actively sustain their leaders. It brilliantly blended divine calling with human agency, acting as a safeguard against tyranny.
That makes a lot of sense.
And it had real teeth, too.
Yeah.
Later in church history, Joseph Smith wanted to remove Sidney Rigdon as a counselor in the leadership. He took it to a vote, and the congregation actually voted against Joseph. They voted to retain Sidney.
Wait, really? And Joseph had to accept it?
He had to accept the result of the vote. The leader could not operate in a vacuum without the consent of the governed.
That is incredible. But, think about a time you trying to launch a new project or stand up for an unpopular belief. It's hard enough when you have support. Now imagine stepping outside your door and having your own neighbors form a literal mob to stop you.
Yeah, the opposition was fierce.
Because, as orderly and democratic as that founding meeting was inside the Whitmer log cabin, the environment outside was just pure chaos.
It really was. As the movement shifted to an area called Colesville, New York, the intense spiritual momentum they were feeling was met with equally intense physical and legal opposition.
From the neighbors.
Right. Local religious leaders were terrified of losing their congregations to this new faith, so they began inciting their followers to stop it.
But the chaos wasn't just physical, right? It was supernatural. Because the first recorded miracle of the new church happens right here in Colesville, and it is honestly terrifying.
It's a very intense account.
A close friend of Joseph's, named Newell Knight, falls into this distorted state. His limbs are twisted, and he is literally caught up off the floor, levitating until he touches the ceiling.
Yeah, it was described as a full-blown possession. Joseph takes Newell by the hand and, acting on faith, commands the devil to depart in the name of Jesus Christ.
And it works.
It does. Newell instantly recovers, and according to the accounts, visions of eternity are opened to his mind right after.
But casting out a devil didn't exactly stop the neighbors from bringing their pitchforks, did it?
Not at all. In fact, things escalated. The church members spent a whole day damming a stream to create a deep enough pond for baptisms. But that night, a mob came in the dark and completely tore the dam apart.
So they rebuild it the next day, they hold the baptisms anyway, but before they can even hold a meeting to confirm the new members, the law steps in again. A constable arrests Joseph Smith for being a disorderly person.
And the way he is treated during this arrest is just brutal.
Yeah, it's pretty awful.
The constable purposely starved him all day. They took him to a tavern where a mob essentially surrounded him. They spat on him, pointed their fingers in his face, and yelled, "Prophesy, prophesy!"
Which is just a direct, intentional imitation of the abuse Christ suffered before the crucifixion.
Exactly. And then, after all that abuse, they actually drag him into a courtroom for trial.
Right, and he's defended by two neighbors, John Reed and James Davidson. These men were respected farmers, not professional lawyers, but they stepped up to defend him against just a barrage of scandalous falsehoods.
They did a remarkable job, too.
The cross-examination during this trial is incredible because the prosecutor, a man named Seymour, tries to weaponize that exorcism of Newell Knight we just talked about. He wants to make the church look like a cult of lunatics.
Right, he thinks he has this perfect trap.
So he puts Newell on the stand and asks him straight up if Joseph cast the devil out.
And Newell clarifies. He says, no, it was done by the power of God. Joseph was merely the instrument.
So Seymour smirks, thinking he has him totally cornered, and asks, "Pray, what did he look like?"
He wants Newell to describe some cartoonish monster so the whole courtroom will just laugh at him.
Exactly. But Newell's response completely shifts the power dynamic in the room. He looks at the lawyer and asks, "Do you, Mr. Seymour, understand the things of the Spirit?"
Seymour says no, he doesn't pretend to such big things.
And Newell just shuts him down. He says it would be of no use to tell him what the devil looked like because it was a spiritual sight, and Seymour wouldn't understand it anyway.
It's brilliant. It completely deflated the prosecutor's strategy. Seymour dropped his head, the audience actually laughed at the lawyer instead of the witness, and Joseph was ultimately acquitted.
Which is a huge victory.
It was. Though, absurdly, the very moment he stepped outside the courtroom, a constable from a neighboring county arrested him on the exact same charge, and they had to do the whole trial process all over again.
It's like trying to hold a peaceful corporate board meeting while a literal riot is breaking out in the lobby. Which raises a really important question about human psychology.
Most definitely.
Did these relentless arrests and mobs actually slow the church down, or did they inadvertently act as PR? Because, if no one cares about what you're doing, they don't form a mob to stop it. The opposition almost validates the importance of the work.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the persecution forged an incredibly tight-knit community. Facing down mob violence and overcoming those legal hurdles proved to the early members that their new organizational structure and their faith could withstand extreme external pressure.
So it hardened their resolve.
Exactly. The crucible made them stronger.
But mobs bind a group together, right? Internal power struggles are what tear a group apart. And the real danger to the young church's survival wasn't the mobs in Colesville. It was internal confusion over who was actually in charge.
Early Mormonism was a highly charismatic movement. People were experiencing visions, they were speaking in tongues, feeling these powerful spiritual manifestations.
Which sounds exciting, but also messy.
Very messy. Pure charisma is chaotic. Without a structure to contain and direct that energy, a movement will just burn itself out.
It's like trying to write a constitution while the revolution is still happening in the streets. They desperately needed an operational blueprint, which came in the form of a revelation known as Doctrine and Covenants, Section 20, or the Articles and Covenants.
Section 20 was the anchor they desperately needed. It outlined the core doctrines of the creation and the fall, but more importantly, it detailed the granular mechanics of running the church.
Logistics again?
Always logistics. It laid out the specific duties of elders, priests, teachers, and deacons. It provided the exact wording for the sacrament prayers and the strict procedure for baptism by immersion. It took all this theoretical spiritual energy and made it functional.
It even adapted to the dangerous logistics of the time, which I found fascinating.
Oh, the wine incident.
Yeah. There's an account where Joseph goes out to buy wine for the sacrament, but he's stopped by a heavenly messenger who warns him not to buy wine from their enemies because they might poison it.
A very real threat at the time.
Right. And this leads to a revelation stating that it doesn't actually matter what they eat or drink for the sacrament as long as their eye is single to God's glory. So it allows them to use water instead of wine, which is a practice the church still follows today.
But implementing this new blueprint, Section 20, was exactly where the internal friction sparked.
Because Oliver Cowdery had a problem with it.
A huge problem. Oliver Cowdery, who is essentially the co-founder and second elder of the church, read a draft of Section 20 and profoundly disagreed with one of the lines about the requirements for baptism.
And he doesn't just, send a polite memo.
No, he wrote a letter to Joseph that was incredibly insubordinate.
He wrote, "I command you in the name of God to erase those words."
Commanding the man you just sustained as the prophet. It was a massive crisis of authority.
How did Joseph handle it?
Joseph had to travel all the way to the Whitmer farm just to confront Oliver and reason with him. He eventually convinced Oliver and the Whitmer family that the original wording was correct, and Oliver backed down.
But no sooner does he put out that fire than an even bigger one starts with a man named Hiram Page.
Hiram Page was a major threat to the church's hierarchy. Let's provide some context here. Page was one of the 8 witnesses.
Which means what, exactly?
These were the men who had been allowed to physically hold and examine the golden plates from which the Book of Mormon was translated. So his word carried massive weight in the community, and Page started using a seer stone.
Okay, what exactly is a seer stone in this context? Because that sounds so foreign to a modern listener.
In 19th century folk culture, a seer stone was an object, often just a unique-looking rock, that was believed to help the user perceive hidden things or receive spiritual messages.
Okay.
Joseph Smith himself had used seer stones during the translation of the Book of Mormon. But now, Hiram Page was using one to receive his own rival revelations about the building of Zion and the order of the church.
So he's democratizing revelation in a way that creates total chaos. I mean, here's where it gets really interesting. If everyone has a stone and everyone is getting competing instructions from God, who is steering the ship, it's like a startup where suddenly 5 different employees are writing their own versions of the company handbook.
Exactly. And many members, including Oliver Cowdery again, were starting to believe Hiram Page's claims. If this wasn't addressed immediately, the movement would have fractured into dozens of competing sects, each following a different visionary.
So what did Joseph do?
Joseph turned to prayer and received what is now Doctrine and Covenants, Section 28.
How does Section 28 solve the problem?
It established a single, unified line of authority. The revelation firmly clarified that while any member could receive personal revelation for their own life, only the president of the church had the right to receive revelations for the entire body of the church.
It drew a hard line in the sand. Like, you can have personal inspiration, but you can't dictate policy for everyone
And
else.
it worked. The schism was squashed. Hiram Page renounced his seer stone, and the congregation voted to sustain Joseph as the sole revelator for the church as a whole.
Going back to common consent again.
Exactly. Without the centralized blueprint of Section 20 and the clear line of authority established in Section 28, the church simply would not have survived its first year. Order was the required vessel to sustain all that spiritual momentum.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? I think the core theme of this deep dive is that building something lasting, whether it's a religion, a business, or a movement, requires a profound, sometimes really painful balance.
It's never just one thing.
Right. You absolutely need the visionary inspiration, that fire that makes people care in the first place, but fire without a fireplace just burns the house down. You need the grueling, unglamorous logistical framework to make it survive. You need the copyrights, the parliamentary procedures, the legal defense, and the granular rule books.
And it reminds us that when examining history, critical thinking is essential. We have to look at both the mundane realities and the miraculous claims side by side to get the full picture of how monumental shifts in history actually occur.
Absolutely. Now, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We talked earlier about the intense missionary efforts during that chaotic first summer of 1830.
Right, getting the word out.
Well, Joseph's younger brother, Samuel Smith, went on a grueling mission. He walked miles upon miles, and by almost every metric, he completely failed.
It was a very tough trip.
He was rejected, he was discouraged, and at one point, he was so frustrated, he just threw a copy of the Book of Mormon down. But he did manage to leave one copy with a man named Phineas Young.
Yes.
Phineas read it, and he passed it to his brother, Brigham Young. Now, Brigham spent 2 whole years cautiously studying that book before he finally decided to join the church. Brigham Young, of course, ultimately became one of the most famous, influential, and formidable figures in American religious history, eventually leading the pioneers across the plains.
A massive historical figure.
And it all traces back to one seemingly failed, discouraging day for a young, exhausted missionary. So consider the ripple effect of our smallest actions. What seemingly insignificant seed are you planting today that might change the world long after you've forgotten about it?